The flag raising over Berlin is probably the most iconic photo of the Eastern Front in World War II. But it never happened. This incident was entirely staged. The real victory banner of the Soviet Union was raised by soldiers of the 150th Rifle Division. No video or picture of the real flag raising survived the Battle of Berlin. The flag says 150th Rifle, Order of Kutuzov 2nd Class, Idrista Division, 79th Rifle Corps, 3rd Shock Army, 1st Belarusian Front. This banner is now a sacred relic of the Russian people, symbolic of their final victory, but also of their unimaginable sacrifices that took the lives of over 20 million soldiers and civilians. It is red, like the lifeblood of over 29,617,000 Red Army soldiers dead, wounded, missing, and crippled out of a sum total of 34 million soldiers. The three bannermen were Lieutenant Berest, Sergeant Yegorov, and Sergeant Kanteria, fighting under the command of Marshal Zhukov. These four men were by modern standards from incredibly impoverished backgrounds. Before the army, Lieutenant Berest was an orphan, Sergeant Yegorov was a partisan, and Sergeant Kanteria was a farm worker. Marshal Zhukov himself was from poor peasant stock and had 3 years of formal schooling. Outside of Russia's cities and its military-industrial complex, the Soviet Union was a third world country. The Red Army of workers and peasants was filled with extremely tough men of austerity and suffering, and often tragedy. It is from the perspective of austerity and struggle which is vital to understanding the Red Army and the Soviet Union. The Red Army and the men who fought in it simply cannot be seen through Western eyes, whether in 1940 or in the comparably decadent times of today. I have two more of the best books on how to understand the Red Army in World War II. These two are on the organization and dynamic change of the Red Army during the war. The first book is Nemesis, the Red Army, 1930 to 1945 by Walter Dunn. Nemesis, the Red Army, 1930 to 1945 is an organizational history of the Red Army during World War II. It functions as a reference guide that can be repeatedly reused on the formation, organization, and structure of the Red Army. It focuses a lot on the development and dynamic change of the Red Army as it adapted to battlefield conditions. Chapters cover Soviet military doctrine, how the Red Army was created, pre-World War II history, wartime mobilization and manpower, the evolution of the Rifle Division, the Soviet replacement system, formation and organization of the tank forces, refining the tank forces, tank crew replacements and training, artillery doctrine and organization, artillery weapons and munitions, and tank destroyers. This book is a highly analytical and statistics-heavy text on all the core aspects of the Red Army. These statistics always come in handy as a reference as you study the campaigns of the Eastern Front. There are a few central arguments here that challenges stereotypes and myths about the Red Army. First, the idea that the Red Army only won by ruthlessly expending masses of men and material. Nemesis, the Red Army, argues with a lot of statistical data that the Soviet Red Army did not win not only due to superior numbers, but also the unique way that they organized their resources, which is very different to how Western forces manage things. The Red Army organized their material resources from the perspective of austerity and less than ideal conditions. Organizational and tactical improvements played a critical part in the victory. The Red Army started out with so many failures, but Soviet generals and planners figured out how to recreate their army from the ashes of defeat in 1941, so it could finally win. A critical factor in Soviet victory was that being poor and austere people, there is an obvious lack of concern the Russians had for appearances. Three things in particular symbolizes everything about their weapons and equipment production. The soldiers of the Red Army have some of the most ugly and crudely manufactured uniforms and battledress of World War II. They wore a canvas bag on their back. They produced 6 million simple but effective ppsh-41 submachine guns. They produced 57,300 crude but effective T-34 tanks. The Germans could not match the production of all of these cheap weapons, and these masses were brought down on them and used to defeat them. So despite having a less developed society and economy than Germany, the Soviet command economy managed to outproduce Germany in many critical categories. They accomplished this by focusing production on equipment that was more suitable to a long war of attrition. The Soviets made deliberate choices of producing cheap and fast-to-produce military goods. They were helped by a Soviet war industry that had a bias towards simplifying design for the needs of a long war of attrition, which requires a maximum quantity of flagship weapon systems rather than an obsessive and counterproductive focus on absurdly expensive weapon systems. The Soviets were also helped in the fact that their state-owned military-industrial complex was not driven by the profit motive, but by production requirements from the Soviet state. Besides their own production, Allied and American Lend-Lease also provided critical help for the Soviet Union's deficiencies. Raw materials, supplies, trucks, jeeps, and communications necessary for maintaining a mechanized army. In comparison to the Russians, the German military and political top mismanaged their war production and their military to extremes, despite having a more capable army and military-industrial complex than the Soviet Union. Against the Western Allies, they deployed the bulk of their fighter force and navy. Against the Soviet Union, they deployed most of their army and most of their bomber and ground attack aviation. But despite the obvious signs that the German Luftwaffe wasn't pulling its weight in the war, the Luftwaffe continued to consume the largest share of Germany's industrial output, even though the most important factor, the German army, was struggling to survive and retreating on all fronts. Worse, by 1943, the German top political and military leadership got completely fixated on developing new technology, tactical minutiae, and raising endless numbers of new, lower-quality combat divisions, rather than becoming more economical and figuring out creative ways to lower costs and increasing real sustainable military power. None of these German excesses shifted the strategic pendulum in their favor and simply accelerated their final defeat. The new technology seduced the heads of state, whether it be super tanks, super U-boats, jet aircraft, and the V-weapons. In a way, the German leadership was deluded by their own propaganda and magical thinking about wonder weapons promising magical solutions to complex military problems. Some of the prominent missteps was their tank production policies. Instead of producing a low-cost and simple universal medium tank like the T-34 or Sherman, the Germans attempted a quest for qualitative superiority. They doubled down on the disease of over-engineering and over-complexity. The wrong designs fed into their industry, degrading their production capabilities to the extreme, and made their armored fighting vehicles very slow to manufacture. The Panzer III and Panzer IV were recognized from the start of the war to be over-engineered main battle tanks. They were expensive as they cost around 110,000 Reichsmarks, and were way too slow to manufacture for a high-intensity war of attrition. The Panther tank was even more expensive and proved to be difficult to maintain in the field. The German Tiger tank variants were insanely expensive. The King Tiger was over 330,000 Reichsmarks and cost the same amount as 4 Sturmgeschütz assault guns or 2 Me-109 fighter aircraft. In the most critical years of World War II, the Germans only produced ridiculously small numbers of tanks. In 1941, they produced 3,600 tanks. In 1942, it was 5,500. When production doubled in 1943, it was way too late and it didn't matter anymore. Germany already lost the war. In comparison, the Soviets produced over 100,000 tanks and self-propelled guns on top of a Lend-Lease donation of over 11,500 between 1941 and 1945. The Russians could produce vastly more medium and heavy armor due to their cheap and simple designs. They outnumbered the Germans in combat throughout the war, often by 3 or even 5 times more in armor. With several times fewer tanks and assault guns available than their opponent, the German infantry paid a horrific price. They lost so much offensive and defensive capability. German infantry was frequently defenseless against mass Soviet armor and got chewed up while suffering heavy losses. German tank crews were chronically underarmed throughout the war, with tank battalions constantly holding on to excess crews. It was standard to see entire Panzer divisions with less than 50 tanks operational most of the time in World War II. All in all, the German army would suffer countless unnecessary losses and failures because they did not have enough tank support. German Panzer divisions would routinely fail in offensive operations due to lack of armor to form sufficient assault spearheads. And it was not just in armored vehicles. The ppsh-41 was produced 6 times the rate of the MP-40, and the Germans were completely outclassed by the Russians in tube artillery. The Soviets produced over 500,000 artillery pieces and mortars. Besides outproducing the Germans in flagship hardware, the Red Army was also helped by the ruthless mobilization of Soviet manpower to maintain frontline superiority of 3-1 at all costs, despite suffering several times more losses. They did this by rapidly replacing casualties and equipment losses, regardless of the training level of new recruits. As the war went on, the Red Army performed massive changes in combat organization, creating huge leaps forward in improving offensive and defensive power after so many failures early on in the war. By summer of 1943, all of these changes in quantity and quality reached critical mass. Soviet firepower delivered by their reorganized artillery arm in the form of artillery divisions and artillery corps were particularly decisive. Red Army assault troops became extremely heavily armed in direct fire weapons, with Russian infantry having 3 times the heavy weapons support per person compared to 1941. So every year, the average Soviet soldier got more and more equipment, firepower, and artillery support. Also, Russian combat units became extremely tough in the defense and improved in the offense. Nemesis, the Red Army, is special because it's especially useful for the beginning student of World War II to get a quick grasp of statistics and organization. No other book is quite like it outside of the tomes of David M. Glantz. This is a shame, as understanding organization first is the key to understanding strategic, operational, and tactical histories of World War II. Typically, people make the mistake of doing strategic first without knowing more detailed, lower levels of war. I believe that before studying organization, armies are an unknown factor, amorphous, incomprehensible mass. After knowing organization, armies become breathing, alive, quantifiable, and tangible. Everything at the strategic, operational, and tactical level starts to make sense. To sum things up, I recommend Nemesis as one of the first books for students of the Eastern Front. It unlocks understanding in so many operational and tactical histories. Without doing so, the beginning student of World War II is impaired. Nemesis paves the runway, so to speak, for higher understanding. The second book on Red Army organization is Stalin's Keys to Victory, The Rebirth of the Red Army in World War II by Walter Dunn. In a way, this book is a continuation of Nemesis, the Red Army. Keys to Victory focuses on several case studies to illustrate with statistics and organization the author's key points. After the massive losses of 1941, some 4.5 million casualties, the Red Army had to rebuild itself over and over again. Each time they did so, they improved their force structure. Some things they did. They shifted from making so many light tanks to concentrating on the T-34. Lend-Lease helped incrementally with food, clothing, trucks, and radios, which freed up more resources for weapons production. Most importantly, though, they dramatically increased equipment levels in combat units. They also reduced the proportion of infantry units in favor of more tank, artillery, and heavy weapons units. These salient points are then presented with orders of battle and a statistical analysis of 4 campaigns. First, the Battle for Moscow in 1941, Stalingrad, 1942, Kursk, 1943, and Bagration or Bagashone in 1944. The author focuses on the condition of the Soviet war economy, logistics and productions of weapons, tanks, artillery, cannons, ammo, and supplies, along with the creation of new formations. In particular, he really emphasizes the process of rebuilding and creating new combat formations, most of them infantry, artillery, and tank, for each campaign, and how enormous the task was for the Soviets. This book is filled with figures from 40 years of research and is based on a database of 9,000 Russian combat units used in World War II. Chapters in the book further focus on Soviet military reform, mobilizing the troops, arms production, and maintaining the divisions under the war of attrition. It's a useful reference and also helps to get a mental grasp in understanding the massive figures involved in sustaining and expanding the Red Army in World War II, after it was destroyed time and time again. It is quite scary to comprehend. I consider Nemesis, the Red Army, and Stalin's Key to Victory to be very helpful and readable guides. I would read these first before the more advanced material by David M. Glantz. The 2 great books to understand the DNA of the Red Army are Stumbling Colossus, focusing on 1941, and its sequel, Colossus Reborn, focusing on 1941 to 1943. If you manage to read and absorb all this material, you will get a pretty advanced education on the Red Army organization that you can use to understand operational and campaign histories to a much higher level. So the great field of Eastern Front history and research are now open to you. Thanks so much for watching. Please help out this channel by liking, subscribing, and ringing the notification bell. And check out the playlist. Comment below on what you think about the equipment of the Red Army in World War II.